Hello, bonjour, je m'appelle Stephen Barani et en tant que professeur à l'Université d'Ottawa et membre du réseau de recherche sur les États fragiles basé au CEPI, based at CIPS. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à notre échange sur l'ODD 16+, et sa mise en œuvre dans les États fragiles et les sociétés en conflit. Among the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in Agenda 2030, SDG 16+ on peaceful societies, access to justice, and effective institutions is often touted as a strategic lever to enable the implementation of other SDGs. That is especially the case in fragile and conflict-affected states and situations, or FCAS for short, where violence and governance are often seen as major constraints on development. 5 years into Agenda 2030, what do official and third-party data suggest about the implementation of SDG 16+ in FCAS? What are critical tendencies in that regard, generally and in particular cases? What factors seem to explain the superficial, though variable, implementation of SDG 16+ in those societies? Avant de présenter nos panélistes, permettez-moi de mentionner l'origine de cette étude, d'abord dans le cadre d'une réflexion critique entamée avec le professeur Marie-Ève Desrosiers et nos partenaires de la chaire UNESCO Défis du développement, notamment l'IEDES à l'Université de Paris 1. Ensuite, dans le cadre d'un processus de réflexion centré sur l'ODD 16, où nous avons impliqué des chercheurs africains, des chercheurs latino-américains, des chercheurs canadiens et d'autres. Après ce processus de réflexion, nous avions envisagé entamer des études de cas plus profondes avec ces mêmes partenaires, mais le manque de ressources nous a dirigés, professeur Sami et moi, à nous orienter vers cette étude secondaire que nous allons présenter et discuter avec vous aujourd'hui. Donc, merci à tous ceux et celles qui ont contribué à ces étapes antérieures. Nous espérons que vous trouverez quand même quelques éléments de réponse à vos questions originales dans cette discussion aujourd'hui. So without further ado, let me introduce to you our panelists. First, my co-authors. Heidi Sami is a professor of international affairs and the director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. He has published widely on issues related to international economics and economic development. His most recent book, co-authored with David Carment, is titled Exiting the Fragility Trap, Rethinking Our Approach in the World's Most Fragile States. It was published last year by Ohio University Press. I'm also delighted to introduce Bianca Washuta, who is completing her MA in International Affairs at the Norman Paterson School. She is also currently working as a junior policy analyst at Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. It's been a pleasure to have Ms. Washuta as a research assistant in part of this project and as a co-author on this paper since then.
Hey, Stephen, I'm just going to jump in here real quick and just say, keep an eye on your microphone because it seems to be rubbing on your tie and creating some static noise.
Thank you. Nous sommes ravis d'avoir deux commentateurs très expérimentés dans ce domaine avec nous aujourd'hui. Kiari Liman Tinguiri est professionnel en résidence à l'École de développement international et de mondialisation à l'Université d'Ottawa et consultant en développement international. Il a travaillé longtemps pour l'ONU, notamment comme coordinateur résident dans maints pays africains. Il a publié en 2015 un livre intitulé « La démocratie dans les États fragiles », publié par l'Harmattan. Il est titulaire d'un doctorat en économie avec une habilitation à diriger des recherches en économie de développement à l'Université de Nancy. Il a enseigné à cette université ainsi qu'à l'Université de Niamey au Niger, son pays d'origine. And finally, Dr. Nipa Banerjee is a senior fellow at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. She earned her doctorate from Carleton University. She served as a practitioner and a policy analyst in international development for over 35 years, including 33 years with the Canadian International Development Agency, which is now part of Global Affairs Canada. She represented Canada for that agency in a number of Asian countries, including being head of aid in Afghanistan in the years following 9/11. So welcome to you all. Bienvenue à vous tous et toutes. La présentation, comme vous l'avez deviné, sera bilingue. Lorsque nous parlons en anglais, la diapositive que vous verrez sur l'écran sera en français et vice-versa. So when we're speaking in French, normally the slide you'll be looking at on your screen will be in English and vice versa. We ask you not to use the chat during the presentation and the comments, please. At the end, we'll have at least 40 minutes for Q's and A's, several rounds of questions and answers. And you'll be able to send us your questions in chat, though we prefer you to intervene orally, of course. So without further ado, Professor Sami, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. Thanks to the University of Ottawa and CIPS in particular for hosting us for today's presentation. I want to set the context a little bit. Stephen has already mentioned this. We were actually motivated by the fact that we are 5 years into Agenda 2030. Every year that goes by, of course, brings us closer to 2030 when we will take stock of what's been accomplished as usual. But we felt that it was the right time to actually look at what's going on, in particular with respect to SDG16, which is extremely important for fragile and conflict-affected states. Our review of the literature basically indicated that there was variation in terms of the degree to which these countries were implementing SDG16. We use 16 plus in the paper to highlight the fact that there's lots of interlinkages among the SDGs, and in particular with SDG16, you can certainly make the argument that it matters for a number of other indicators that are part of for a number of other goals that are part of the 2030 agenda. In this debate, I think you have people who have argued that SDG16, if we get it right, could be a strategic lever for all the other SDGs. So if countries were to be able to implement what was recommended in terms of targets and indicators, it would have a positive impact on many other indicators. But of course, on the other side, you have those who highlight the fact that there's a number of problems related to SDG 16, and we classify them as methodological and then more substantive constraints. At the methodological level, I think one of the key problems for fragile states is that they often have difficulty mobilizing resources to collect data, and that's a key issue for many of them. They don't have the resources to collect data, or sometimes the indicators that were proposed are often seen as having a limited view of what would constitute peace, justice, and governance in these countries. In terms of more substantive constraints, I think a key element there is the lack of political will on the part of certain countries to implement Agenda 2030 broadly, but in particular the goals and indicators related to SDG 16. One of the things that we do in this paper is we build on a literature that comes from biology, which looks at the evolution of species, and that has been sort of co-opted by people on the development side, like Len Pritchett and some of his co-authors, and people who look at neo-institutional neo-institutionalism as a sort of framework of reference use this concept in order to explain why sometimes countries may appear to be doing certain things in form, but not in function. I'll come back to this in a minute. So basically, we had two questions that we were interested in. Why is it that, what is the current state of the situation right now in terms of implementation in fragile and conflict-affected states with respect to SDG 16 plus? And then how do you explain this variation that we know exists when we look at some of the official documents that have come out in recent years? So what could explain this variation in terms of implementation? And we have two underlying hypotheses for what we think is the explanation. One is this so-called concept of isomorphic mimicry, where there's a tendency to only superficially implement some of the objectives, but where we also expect to see significant variation. And then our second hypothesis is that this difference in terms of implementation results from the interaction among different actors, institutions, and contextual factors. Next slide, please. So our frame of reference, or theoretical framework, if you will, as I said, comes from this idea of isomorphic mimicry, which again, as I mentioned earlier, basically says that countries, just like organisms from biology, will often give external actors or people who observe them from a distance the appearance that they are making efforts in form but not in function. In biology, what this describes essentially is that organisms will evolve to look similar to others in order to survive. So they gain an evolutionary advantage. If you want to use a crude example, I suppose one thing that really comes to mind in my case is that you can look at some countries, for example, that have set up institutions to fight corruption, right? So they mimic what arguably Western countries do by setting up these institutions in the same way that they exist elsewhere. But then if you look at the efficacy or the efficiency of these institutions to actually deal with corruption, you find that they can't do it. So they exist in form, the building is there, people are working in it, but then when it comes to actual results, there's not much that happens, right? So they exist in form, but not in function. And there are many reasons why this may happen. One could be simply that they don't have qualified people, but the other argument could also be that there's a lack of political will from elites in particular to actually implement change. So that's where we started from. And then we broaden this framework in order to link it to neo-institutional theory, which is again about the collective choice of agents and how the interactions with others is often constrained by political will and other constraints that may exist in the system. So we argue in the paper that having this frame of reference, building from isomorphic mimicry and then neo-institutionalism can help us understand why we have variation in ODDs, in SDG 16 plus. I guess ultimately, and Stephen will probably come back to this later on, it's in our view far too easy sometimes to just pin everything down to the lack of resources, right? It would be very easy for everyone to say, well, they can't really do this because they don't have the financial resources. But I think it's more complicated than this simple story that just links everything to lack of financial means. Next slide, please. So notre approche et la méthode que nous utilisons se base sur deux piliers essentiellement. Nous avons commencé l'analyse en regardant de façon très générale ce qui se passe à travers plusieurs pays. Donc, nous avons les pays qui sont fragiles, qui sont membres du G7+. Il y en a 20 à peu près, il y a 20 membres du G7+. Et nous regardons aussi les autres qui sont considérés comme étant fragiles en nous basant sur l'indice de fragilité de Fund for Peace, que certains d'entre vous connaissent certainement. Donc, en tout, nous avons une soixantaine de pays quand nous commençons avec l'examen très élargi. Et après, ce que nous faisons, nous regardons en particulier 8 États fragiles, dont 4 sont des membres du G7+, et 4 autres. Notre choix en termes de sélection des cas est basé sur plusieurs critères. Nous avons voulu avoir un groupe de pays parmi les 8 cas, nous voulions avoir des pays à faible revenu, des pays à revenu moyen. Nous voulions avoir des pays qui sont en guerre, ceux qui ont pu sortir de la guerre et qui connaissent en ce moment un calme relatif dans plusieurs cas. Nous voulions savoir aussi s'il y avait une différence entre certains pays qui ont démontré vraiment ce qu'on appelle le goodwill ou une volonté en fait d'amener des changements. Par exemple, Timor-Leste est un cas, alors que dans d'autres comme l'Irak, il n'y a pas beaucoup de progrès. Donc, nous avons voulu aussi choisir des pays en fonction de leur volonté de faire des changements. Et finalement, nous avons basé notre sélection des cas en partie sur notre expertise. Donc, d'une façon un peu plus pratique, Steven et moi, nous avons des expertises dans différents pays, différentes régions. Et donc, nous sommes arrivés à un mix finalement de 8 pays que vous voyez sur votre écran. Et en plus de ces deux piliers, ce que nous faisons, en fait, nous faisons une triangulation en utilisant des données qui viennent d'autres sources, des données quantitatives, donc quantitatives et qualitatives. Et une des choses que nous faisons, en fait, c'est vraiment examiner en profondeur les revues nationales volontaires que les pays soumettent. Donc, ça, c'est une approche qui est quand même très différente. For those who are not familiar with the voluntary national reviews, it's actually a departure from the practice of implementation that existed before, which was really to implement globally, usually coming from the Secretary General's office, right? So in the past, most reviews were done, implemented globally, and they were based on the Secretary General's reports. The VNR is a new approach because it brings together a number of things. One is it's country-led, donc c'est les pays qui en fait décident, qui vont être les, si vous voulez, c'est eux qui vont, how do you say, lead, they are the ones who will lead the process. Et donc, ces pays-là vont prendre en considération leur propre réalité au niveau national. Et finalement, il y a cet aspect de ownership pour les Voluntary National Reviews. Donc, les pays eux-mêmes vont être en possession, en contrôle de l'agenda, si vous voulez. Donc, ça, c'est quand même une approche qui est quand même très différente de ce qui existait avant. Et de ce point de vue-là, c'est très intéressant parce que d'un côté, les pays, on pourrait émettre l'hypothèse qu'ayant le contrôle, ils vont pouvoir dire n'importe quoi. Mais en même temps, ce n'est pas tout à fait vrai parce qu'ils sont obligés aussi de dire ce qui se passe parce qu'on peut toujours vérifier. Donc, nous, notre approche, c'est de ne pas seulement prendre pour acquis ce qu'ils nous disent, mais de vérifier à travers d'autres sources s'il y a une corroboration, en fait, avec ce qu'ils disent et ce que nous découvrons. Next slide, please. So in terms of the results that we found, I think this slide speaks for itself, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I think we came to the conclusion that, you know, there's been progress if you look at the big picture, but that the implementation is actually uneven. And so that reinforced our view that diving more deeply into the cases would actually give us, you know, more detail about why this is happening. Of course, one of the things that we could not avoid as we were working on this paper is COVID-19. I think most of you know that COVID-19 is probably going to undermine the SDGs more broadly in terms of a progress, but also progress on SDG16. One final thing I will say about this slide is, you know, there's very few papers right now that have focused specifically on FCAS. Most of the reports that have come out talk about SDG16 in general, but they don't zero in on the difficulties that fragile and conflict affected states may be facing, or even some of the good news stories, right, that may be coming out of these states, because there are countries among the fragile states that have actually made quite a bit of progress on SDG16. What's interesting is that when you look at the big picture, in fact, and this is part of the good news story, is that many of them have implemented national statistical plans, even if they are not fully funded and even if data is missing. And so our argument, which I mentioned earlier, is that there's something to be said about political will as an important intervening variable in that big picture. And the final slide that I will show you is this table. C'est un tableau qu'on a construit à partir des données qu'on avait sur les VNRs, les Voluntary National Reviews. Et ce qui est intéressant dans ce tableau, c'est qu'une grande majorité des pays du G7+, et d'autres États fragiles ont en fait soumis les rapports volontaires en 2020. Donc, on a calculé le nombre de pays qui ont soumis au moins un rapport depuis 2015. Et par exemple, parmi les pays du G7+, il y en a 70% qui ont soumis un rapport, donc 14 sur 20. Ça veut dire qu'il y a des pays comme Haïti, par exemple, ou le Yémen qui n'en ont pas soumis. Parmi les autres États fragiles, il y a 35 sur 46 qui ont soumis. Donc, quand même, 76% des pays, encore une fois, ont soumis. Et finalement, pour les pays du G7+, il y a 55% des pays qui ont indiqué qu'ils prennent en considération l'ODD 16 et que c'est une priorité pour eux et qui font un rapport, en fait, sur les progrès qu'ils ont accomplis. Le seul bémol avec notre tableau, c'est que le dernier petit carré, on n'a pas encore compilé l'information, mais c'est quelque chose qu'on a l'intention de faire pour avoir une vue d'ensemble, en fait. Donc, je vais laisser la parole maintenant à Steven, qui va probablement demander à Bianca de continuer. C'est ça, Steven?
Oh, oui, Bianca, the mic is yours.
Hi,
Merci,
everyone.
Teddy.
So my name is Bianca. I just wanted to begin by thanking everyone so much for taking time out of your days to be here. I know that we really appreciate it. So today I will be presenting on 3 of the 8 case studies that we conducted for our paper: Afghanistan, Colombia, and Sierra Leone. These case studies were selected because they represent a variety of factors that we also found in our larger sample. They're from different regions of the world, a mixture of low to middle income economies. Some are still engaged in conflict, whereas others are recovering, and some are known for their strong efforts on SDG implementation, whereas others are not. So the first case is Afghanistan. Given its long history of conflict and international intervention, Afghanistan still struggles to find a path out of fragility. In 2017, it released its first and only VNR alongside a national peace and development framework, which outlines reforms necessary to achieve the SDGs more broadly. Its VNR was produced after consulting with a variety of stakeholders and was adopted ultimately to overcome these legacies of conflict and what it refers to as stunted development. Afghanistan only reported on 6 SDGs that were set for review at the 2017 UN High-Level Political Forum. So since SDG16 was not prioritized that year, it's seldom cited in this VNR. But despite this, it was said to have informed efforts related to internally displaced persons in the country. Several challenges were identified that make progress difficult to quantify: limited data collection, inadequate resources, as well as operating in an insecure environment. The third-party resources that we looked at suggest some progress has been made, however, highlights enduring conflict and elite resistance as factors that ultimately constrain reforms. So for this reason, limited or simulated implementation of SDG 16+ in Afghanistan can be explained by limited political will and conflict rather than access to financial resources or institutional capacity per se. Next slide, please. So our second case study is Colombia, which is a middle-income country and one of the longest-standing democracies in Latin America, but also one that has been affected by long-term violence and human rights abuses, even with renewed efforts to break with conflict and uneven development. Colombia has released 2 VNRs and has a 3rd scheduled for next year, and like Afghanistan, has created national level policies to organize efforts and use as progress markers. Examples here include the National Development Plan, which links growth with social inclusion, justice, and peace. And the government also points to the 2016 peace accord with the FARC guerrilla group, as well as decreases in homicide rates as evidence of progress. The 2018 VNR mostly targeted other goals, but still recognized that SDG16 plus is important for sustainable development. And the third-party data that we looked at indicates that Colombia has made progress in the last decade, but that some of it has been slowed or even reversed in some cases after the 2016 elections. So challenges persist in peace building, reducing corruption, and protecting political and civil rights. The government has ultimately underperformed in critical areas. So in this case, the factors behind the limited or illusory implementation of SDG 16 plus are the lack of political motivation by Colombia's government and other elites seeking to preserve their privileges and impunity. Next slide, please. So the third and final case study that I'll be presenting today is Sierra Leone, which is a low-income country in West Africa that has made SDG implementation a very clear priority since 2015 and continues to consolidate peace after a civil war that ended in 2002. It aims to become a middle-income country by 2035 and promotes justice and peace as central components of its national development. So like Colombia, Sierra Leone has released 2 VNRs so far and has a third scheduled for next year. And like Afghanistan and Colombia, Sierra Leone has also created policies at the national level aligned with the SDGs. Their most sizable is the Medium-Term National Development Plan, of which SDG implementation is a subcategory. So the government points to this policy as well as free elections and reductions in political violence as progress markers. It clearly identifies SDG 16 as an accelerator for development, and third-party data supports this. Like Afghanistan, data collection and limited fiscal resources are cited as primary obstacles, but unlike Afghanistan, visible efforts have been made in the country to combat this, such as improving the quality of quantitative data via regularized statistical surveys. The factors that hinder Sierra Leone are clear: corruption, police and gender-based violence, as well as economic recovery from the Ebola outbreak of 2014. However, Sierra Leone has also demonstrated very strong political will and a unique commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 16, that sets it apart. So in sum, the factors explaining implementation in Sierra Leone weigh on the side of limited institutional and fiscal capacities. This means that the country is relatively well positioned for long-term progress as it continues to receive appropriate financial and technical assistance. So that concludes my review of our 3 case studies for this presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Bianca. Bon, alors, comme vous voyez dans ce schéma, nous avons tenté de représenter les tendances identifiées sur la base de cette étude par l'entremise de cette matrice. Sur l'axe X, en horizontal, vous trouverez le degré d'attention de prise en compte de l'ODD 16+, dans les rapports nationaux volontaires en particulier. Et sur l'axe Y, vous trouverez le degré de changement ou de progrès de facto au niveau de la substance dans différents pays. Cette matrice nous permet de situer Timor-Leste en haut et à droite du cadre, reflétant son rôle de champion de l'ODD 16+ au niveau international, mais aussi les importants progrès de facto notés dans notre étude de cas. À l'autre extrême, la matrice nous permet de situer la République démocratique du Congo en bas à gauche pour ce qui reflète à la fois le fait que le gouvernement a très peu pris en compte l'ODD 16 et ses liens avec les autres ODD dans son premier et unique rapport sur la mise en œuvre des objectifs qui a été publié cette année, si je ne m'abuse. Et ce positionnement reflète aussi le fait qu'en réalité, de facto, on note sur la base de notre lecture de données indépendantes, on note très peu de progrès dans ce contexte et même comment dirais-je, des pas en arrière dans ce cas-là au niveau des enjeux relatifs à l'accès à la justice, la réduction de différentes formes de violence, l'imputabilité des institutions, etc. Entre ces deux extrêmes, on voit aussi la distribution de cas assez variés, avec une certaine attention prêtée à l'ODD 16 plus dans la plupart des autres cas, mais moins de progrès sur le plan de facto. Par exemple, en Colombie, qu'on retrouve dans la colonne de droite pour indiquer le fait que la Colombie se voit aussi comme champion de l'ODD 16, le prend très au sérieux sur papier, mais qu'elle n'a pas encore pu démontrer des résultats probants dans plusieurs domaines relatifs à l'ODD 16 sur le terrain. Donc, pour passer à la prochaine diapositive, en d'autres mots, donc les 8 États et sociétés fragiles qu'on a ciblés dans cette étude ont tous entrepris des consultations, ils ont tous adapté les ODD à leurs priorités, à leurs plans nationaux. Ils ont pris l'ODD 16 en particulier en compte dans leur rapport volontaires qu'ils ont tous soumis à l'ONU. Mais rappelons-nous que 30% des membres du G7+, comme Haïti, comme le Sud-Soudan, comme le Yémen, n'ont pas encore soumis de rapport, donc on n'a pas de données de leur point de vue à l'égard de la mise en œuvre de cet ODD et des autres. Et presque le quart des autres États fragiles dans notre échantillon élargi, par exemple, la Syrie, le Venezuela, n'ont pas, eux non plus, soumis des rapports volontaires. Et s'ils en soumettaient, ou quand ils en soumettront éventuellement, on peut supposer que leur performance de facto à cet égard ne sera pas très encourageante, elle non plus. Alors, pour aller un peu plus loin, donc c'est vrai, il n'y a pas de doute que des gouvernements comme ceux de la Colombie, le Sierra Leone, se présentent comme disons, des champions, des avocats de l'ODD 16 au niveau international, et ils reconnaissent son importance dans leurs plans, dans leurs rapports internes, etc., etc. Mais quand on descend, quand on regarde les données qu'ils présentent eux-mêmes, et que d'autres sources indépendantes présentent, là, on voit que les différences au niveau de la mise en œuvre des facto commencent à se démontrer, à se démarquer. Donc, on note d'importants progrès, comme mes collègues l'ont dit, dans certains États fragiles et de sociétés en conflit. Donc, l'accord de paix en Colombie, ce n'est pas juste un accord papier. Hein, il est historiquement très important. Il y a maintes clauses de chapitres de cet accord qui ont été partiellement mises en œuvre. Au Sierra Leone, il y a eu toute une série d'élections libres et justes depuis 2002. Il y a eu une grande diminution des violences politiques associées aux élections dans ce même contexte. Mais même dans ces contextes où les gouvernements se disent engagés pour la mise en œuvre de l'ODD 16 et du reste du projet d'ODD, même dans ces contextes, on voit des grands défis au niveau sur le plan de facto. Donc, l'assassinat de centaines d'activistes en Colombie est un exemple criard à cet égard. La violence, les injustices et la faiblesse des institutions est encore plus dramatique dans les autres cas qu'on a répertoriés, notamment en Afghanistan, en Irak ou en République démocratique du Congo. Bien sûr, la collecte des données reste un défi dans tous les États fragiles. Mais certains gouvernements, pas seulement celui du Timor, le champion évident, mais aussi celui de la Colombie et même celui du Sierra Leone, font du renforcement de leur capacité de collecte et d'analyse statistique de données, font de cela une priorité, ce qui n'est pas le cas pour les autres gouvernements. On voit aussi, on note aussi des contraintes très variables. Donc, la faible volonté politique des élites et l'intensité des conflits violents sont des facteurs clés qui expliquent la mise en œuvre superficielle ou imitative de l'ODD 16+, dans les États fragiles, par exemple RDC, Afghanistan et Irak. So, my apologies to English speaker. One of the downsides of being multilingual is that sometimes you don't notice what you're reading. I should have described this slide in English, and let me finish then in English for everybody. So if we drill down and situate these different cases in this matrix, if we look at the detail of what is happening in each country, we see that the weak political will and the intensity of violent armed conflict are key factors that explain the general tendency towards superficial or imitative SDG16+ implementation in many of these cases. But if we flip those factors, since they're variables, independent variables, we see that where there is a clear political will and where the armed conflict has been brought to an end, that those are obviously very favorable factors that explain in part degrees of progress in countries like Sierra Leone and particularly in Timor-Leste. So let me continue in English and wrap up. This is our last slide. So our paper ends with some ideas about what the implications of this analysis are, first of all, in practice. And so the first and perhaps rather obvious implication, but it bears repeating, is that it suggests that countries, that donors, for example, the international community, should not only place or assign priority to countries that are still in conflict, that are not making great progress, but would definitely stay the course and continue supporting financially, technically, politically, and otherwise governments, CSOs, and other stakeholders in contexts where there is political will, clear political will, and an end to the armed conflict, where those factors align to facilitate the implementation of SDG16. We also leave open the question of what to do in other contexts. The real burning question is not whether or not to remain engaged in more fragile and conflict-affected contexts where there is less political will, sometimes dramatically less, and where the conflict is still active, the armed conflict. But really the question becomes, well, what are the policy options in those contexts for example, fostering the coalescence of coalitions between genuine reformers within state institutions and civil society organizations or social movements where they exist that are pushing for not only implementation of that agenda, but sometimes for larger, more transformational changes. Obviously, we also reflect on avenues for further research. So clearly, one of the things that was certainly confirmed by this exercise of trying to look at a very broad sample and then a narrower, but still quite broad sample of 8 cases is that this is useful, but we need deeper case studies, particularly if we want to understand the more complex dynamics beyond these macro level factors that we draw your attention to, if we want to understand the more meso and micro level dynamics of SDG16+ implementation in different contexts. So deeper case studies, fewer cases are still very much needed. large N studies or studies of other cases are also needed. So studies of SDG implementation or movement on the substantive goals in SDG 16 plus are important, even in countries where, and perhaps even more so in countries where the governments are not reporting on that. So Haiti is one of those countries, and there's been absolutely no attention to why it is unable. Some of the answers are obvious, we can get back to them, but there are no systematic case studies out there of SDG 16 plus in those contexts, or of other important issues, including the impacts of the pandemic in those countries, which we assume to be devastating, but there's actually very little data on why the impacts of the pandemic may be variable in these contexts, why the responses will probably be variable and will have then downstream differential health and other public goods impacts in those countries. Last but not least, we really hope that some colleagues and students will have been interested at least or intrigued by our attempt to use concepts like isomorphic mimicry and other concepts from neo-institutional theory to guide this study. But we also invite colleagues who are not particularly enamored with that perspective to engage in the debate. Personally, I would find it really, really interesting to see studies of these same issues in some of these or other cases from an intersectional feminist perspective, for example. I think that lens could really enable us to look at why and how certain men and women, but not others, access SDG processes, why others remain excluded, why there may be broad inclusion even from an intersectional perspective at the level of the process through government consultations, but what the outcomes aren't changing on the ground in subsectors, for example. So I think an intersectional feminist perspective would enable us to go much further in probing the politics of inclusion and exclusion in the SDG 16 or the wider SDG project. And I really hope, and this is a challenge, an invitation to scholars, students, and others who see the world through other perspectives to actually join in this debate today and beyond in the years to come. Thank you very much. So without further ado, then we will pass on, we will move on to our first commentator, Dr. Nipa Banerjee. As Dr. Kiari Limantinguri has a few slides he'll show, and so we want to sort out the technicalities of that first. So we'll ask Dr. Banerjee to be the first commentator, et ensuite Dr. Banerjee sera suivi par Dr. Limantinguri. Nipa, over to you, please. Can you please unmute your mic?
Thank you, Stephen. Well,
go ahead.
In case there was any problem, when I'm technically, I'm not very good, and sometimes there are problems. So stop me and check out if things are going okay. I mean, first of all, do you see me? Okay.
Yes.
It's okay. All right. Thank you. The subject area covered by this working paper is extensive and complex. I will reflect today on the paper's broad findings and comments, link them to a specific country case, and analyze their significance and pertinence for planning and implementing SDG 16. My analysis focus on the factors identified in the working paper as critical, affecting SDG 16 planning and implementation. The particular country selected is Afghanistan, ranking high in the Fragility Index. Now I will go along applying some of the findings and my observations related to some of the factors which have been mentioned this morning. Factor 1, rule of power elites or political will. Earlier this week, as I was reviewing the preliminary findings of today's paper, word spread that in Afghanistan, planning and actions to generate conditions critical for moving towards peace have stalled. That is, mainly the negotiating process has stopped. And this was because of deliberate interventions from power elites in the government, allegedly for protecting their political power. The Afghan government and the government negotiating team are split on the continuation of peace talks when utility is of utmost importance. When unity is of utmost importance. Under such circumstances, an objective negotiating body taking the lead in peace talks and the reconciliation process without being influenced by the power elites is the highest priority. But no reconciliation council or institution is yet operational. The official and unofficial sources conjecture that the Afghan power elites' disengagement from the peace talks, the disunity and split in the power elite, and the absence of institutional operating infrastructure in the form of a well-structured reconciliation council are likely to strengthen the position of those in the Taliban leadership advocating a military solution to the conflict. The events of this week in Afghanistan and the accompanying analyses support our presenter's argument that in fragile states, the power elites often serve as spoilers on the way of SDG16 plus achievements. This is the political bill, basically. Just before this meeting started, I got the news that apparently they will start the peace talks. We'll see how the political elites react to that. Factor 2, institutional, technical, and financial capacity. Our presenters agree with the earlier research findings that the conceptual link between SDG16 and the SDG16 plus targets are clear, although no clear empirical connection has yet been established, mainly because of lack of adequate data. This working paper links data unavailability to the FCAS government's lack of resources and capacity to collect the required data, including a lack of baseline information to assess progress. Laxity of data and the allied problems are noted in Afghanistan's VNRs. As they think that these are very important and their lack of progress is due to the lack of technical expertise as well as financial resources. As remedial measures, the working paper suggests technical assistance from international donors and third-party data providers, such as CSOs and international organizations. The latter could play a pivotal role until suitable government mechanisms are put in place. However, I will raise an alert here based on Afghanistan's past experience with technical assistance. In the past, Afghanistan has been burdened with low-quality technical assistance for capacity building. Technical assistance will be useful only if experienced TAs are appointed and the TA is demand-driven based on needs and not necessarily supply-driven. Afghanistan is encountering serious challenges in the SDG financing and reports that it will be impossible to meet the SDGs funding needs as the donor pledges decline. Therefore, the donor pledges, in fact, are declining, as it was proved in the Geneva Conference. Therefore, it will be necessary to complement and, where possible, substitute foreign aid with finances mobilized from domestic and international resources, international sources, including private investment. Factor 3, role of CSOs and third-party providers. Our presenters say that an inclusive process through the involvement of third-party providers is useful, as they act as independent benchmarks against official country data to determine inconsistencies or irregularities in reporting. While governments are expected to take the lead in reviewing progress towards the SDGs, national level monitoring must go beyond the remit of governments to include civil society and other stakeholders. I mention here Transparency International's report on Afghanistan's SDG16 planning and the critical findings on several SDG targets, along with key recommendations. These SDG targets with key recommendations. Report of this nature, by drawing attention to the strengths and weaknesses of planning, implementation, and monitoring of SDG 16, help to improve the quality of VNRs and promote progress towards achieving SDG 16 plus targets. Factor 4, selective approach to SDG planning. Concerns expressed by our presenters is that the national reviews, stamped as voluntary, left the way open for FCAS to focus the VNRs on selected goals only, thus avoiding those that would threaten the power of the elites and promote unwillingness of certain elites to fight corruption, not nurture inclusive governance, and promote access to justice. Our presenters' concerns in this score are valid. Afghanistan's VNR of 2017 had no reference to the SDG 16 goals when the country ranked high in its corruption perception index. Transparency International's report on Afghanistan's sustainable development covers this subject well with the remark, government's anti-corruption efforts are insufficient for its SDG commitments. Factor 5, isomorphic mimicry. This really interests me. The issue of isomorphic mimicry raised in the working paper is of significant pertinence in FCAS. In Afghanistan, the security sector and police reforms bear the images of isomorphic mimicry. The Afghan police in uniform does not perform normal policing functions to enforce the rule of law, control crime, and protect Afghan citizens, as expected from any national police service. The Afghan National Police functions as a militarized counterinsurgency force, not meeting the Afghan people's policing needs. The security sector reform, police reform, and law and order reforms, all carrying the image of isomorphic mimicry, were undertaken in Afghanistan with donor assistance and under donor supervision over the last 18 years. Periodic studies had been conducted addressing the concerns, but the challenges have not been handled appropriately. Going over my discussion points for this presentation this morning and postulating on state building and development in fragile situations, I felt that I and our principal presenters placed responsibilities for all shortcomings related to SDGs, SDG 16 progress on the national governments. I felt that as the last speaker, as nearly the last speaker, I guess I am, Stephen? Oh, As sort of nearly the last speaker in the panel, I must draw the attention of all to donor responsibilities in the failure to meet the SDG16 challenges, especially in highly fragile situations with weak institutions. Hopefully, our presenters' expanded and in-depth country studies will throw more light on this subject. I'm equally interested in learning about the detailed findings of the SDG16 status in contrasting contexts, such as Timor-Leste and Afghanistan, and words from our researchers on the utility and practicability of such comparisons. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Nipa, for that very generous testing, if you will, of some of our ideas against a much deeper reading of the Afghan case, and for suggesting some issues that remain to be discussed. Without further pause, I will hand the floor to Dr. Niman Tingwidi, and I will try to show his slides. It may take a minute.
Okay, merci beaucoup. I will speak in French. I think it's easier for me and better for you. So to help those who are more comfortable in English, I put together some slides so they can follow easily. If we manage to put them on, they can follow much easily what I will be saying. Donc,
on essaie toujours. Je vous demande.
Ok,
allez-y. Puis
je peux commencer à parler. Alors, j'ai des commentaires de trois types. J'ai des commentaires j'ai des commentaires plus généraux sur les suivis de l'ODD 16. Et là, je fais un peu un recul. Je rappelle qu'il n'y a rien comme un OMD 16. On est passé des ODD, des OMD aux ODD et on a ajouté l'ODD 16. C'est assez particulier. C'est très important d'avoir inclus ces questions comme la paix, comme la lutte contre la corruption, etc. Mais il faut se rappeler que ça n'existait pas au moment des OMD. Et le gros du suivi qu'on fait sur le terrain, les outils, la plupart des outils ont été développés pour suivre les OMD. Si vous prenez par exemple les grandes enquêtes de type mix ou certaines enquêtes démographiques et sociales, ils ont été calibrés pour permettre de suivre les ODD. Alors on suit très facilement la mortalité, on suit très facilement l'accès à l'eau potable et à l'assainissement. C'est beaucoup plus difficile, on a beaucoup moins d'outils pour suivre un ODD comme l'ODD 16. Ça, je pense que c'est un point assez important et c'est encore plus vrai évidemment dans les pays très pauvres. Vous pouvez mettre le prochain slide. Alors, dans les pays, en particulier en Afrique au sud du Sahara, il est assez facile de voir quels sont les États fragiles et les États qui sont en situation de conflit. Là aussi, quand vous regardez le système des Nations Unies, on a une bonne connaissance des États qui sont en situation de conflit, avec ou sans présence de DPKO. Mais il n'y a pas de liste officielle d'États fragiles aux Nations Unies. On a une liste officielle des pays moins avancés, les LDCs. Et il y a même un sous-secrétaire général qui s'en occupe. Mais vous n'avez aucun démembrement qui est en charge des États simplement fragiles. Il y a des États qui sont fragiles et qui n'ont pas de conflit en ce moment au moins. Par exemple, la Sierra Leone sur lequel on va revenir. Un troisième point assez difficile en ce qui concerne la mise en œuvre de l'ODD 16, là je parle surtout pour les pays sahéliens, c'est que la situation de conflit crée des revenus et génère des rentes. Et donc, vous ne pouvez pas les arrêter simplement sur la seule volonté politique. Il faut un substitut de revenus ou de rente pour que ça s'arrête. Si vous prenez le nord Mali ou le nord du Niger, des populations entières qui vivaient jadis d'activités liées au tourisme, ben, sont maintenant très clairement dans des vivent et prospèrent en faisant des activités qui sont liées au trafic d'armes, au trafic de migrants, au trafic illicite. Et évidemment, dans ces conditions-là, la réalisation de la cible 4, par exemple, pose un problème de substitut. On ne pouvait pas juste par la volonté, comme on n'a pas les moyens militaires de réduire ça. L'autre commentaire que je veux faire, c'est surtout lié à l'approche un peu néo-institutionnaliste que vous utilisez dans le papier. Et ça aussi, c'est assez vrai, je pense, dans les pays africains, c'est que lorsque l'accession au pouvoir, lorsque les régimes sont des régimes démocratiques, c'est-à-dire ils passent par des élections, et que l'État, la machine étatique, l'administration est faible, il semblerait que de façon systémique, cette situation-là génère la création de systèmes de patronage et de clientélisme. En tout cas, c'est ce que soutient Francis Fukuyama dans son Political Order and Political Decay. J'ai regardé attentivement les chapitres 5, 8 et 19. La chose est très claire. Et quand vous regardez, et dans un cas que je connais assez bien, comme celui du Niger, l'administration la moins corrompue dont on se souvient est un régime autoritaire. Et ce régime-là date il y a plus de 20 ans. Ce régime-là date d'avant le système démocratique. Donc, il y a un problème systémique, je crois, qui va un peu plus au-delà de juste la volonté politique des élites, quel que soit ce qu'on met dans le terme d'élite. Le dernier point un peu général que je fais, c'est que bon, l'alignement des ODD avec les objectifs nationaux de planification, oui, c'est critiquable, comme le critique le papier, mais c'est déjà ça. Le parfait ne doit pas être dans cette situation-là tout à fait l'ennemi du bien, même si, une fois encore, l'alignement n'est pas suffisant parce que les instruments nationaux de planification tels que le plan national de développement économique et social ou les plans à moyen terme eux-mêmes souffrent de beaucoup d'insuffisances opérationnelles. Vous pouvez mettre le prochain slide, s'il vous plaît. J'ai ensuite quelques commentaires sur la méthodologie. Et là aussi, c'est des commentaires vraiment d'une perspective très, très pratique. Je pense d'abord que la triangulation, c'est une très bonne méthode. Il faut, parce qu'effectivement, les gouvernements eux-mêmes ont tendance à fournir les données et à choisir les sources qui embellissent leur performance. Cela est à peu près naturel dans tous les pays. Personne ne mettrait sur la place publique ses propres insuffisances. Mais le choix des sources de triangulation n'est pas neutre. Et j'ai regardé attentivement, et je reviendrai dessus tout à l'heure, sur les deux pays sur lesquels je commentais, Niger et Sierra Leone. Quand vous choisissez Mo Ibrahim, oui, vous validez beaucoup certaines des données qui viennent des rapports nationaux volontaires, mais si vous allez regarder, par exemple, chez le BTI, qui fait l'évaluation de la gouvernance depuis longtemps et qui donne des appréciations qualitatives, vous allez nuancer fortement certaines choses, telles que l'accès à la justice, etc. Le deuxième commentaire que je veux faire, c'est sur, toujours méthodologique, sur la question de données. J'ai bien noté que vous utilisez les données qualitatives, mais l'accent était quand même mis trop sur les données quantitatives. On donne des indicateurs comme par exemple l'utilisation des dépenses primaires du budget. Bon, quand on connaît la crédibilité des budgets dans nos États, moi-même je suis originaire du Niger et j'ai récemment travaillé sur le Tchad où j'ai étudié les questions de finances publiques pour le compte de l'UNICEF, le financement du bien-être des enfants. Eh bien, la crédibilité du budget, c'est quelque chose d'assez rare. Alors, le mimétisme isomorphique, bon, moi je considère que ce n'est pas totalement incompatible avec l'approche institutionnaliste et je ne considère pas que c'est mauvais. C'est vrai que dans la pratique, quand vous êtes représentant de l'UNICEF ou représentant du PNUD et que vous travaillez avec les États, vous les aidez à faire ces rapports-là, c'est sûr qu'il y a une tendance à essayer d'imiter les États avancés. Mais n'empêche que dans le processus, vous apprenez beaucoup. Par exemple, quand vous travaillez sur le rapport que devait soumettre au comité avant la mise en place des évaluations périodiques universelles, pour chaque comité, par exemple, pour le droit de l'enfant, les États soumettaient des rapports. Mais la qualité des rapports augmente, même si le premier rapport est une simple imitation, le seul fait d'impliquer les organisations de la société civile qui peuvent présenter un contre-rapport, l'exercice lui-même, de mon point de vue, a une capacité pédagogique. Ça forme les capacités. Donc, c'est vrai, au départ, le mimétisme n'est peut-être pas bienvenu. Ça peut sembler être tout à fait vain, mais je ne pense pas qu'il le soit toujours. Alors, passons au troisième slide où je commente sur les deux pays sur lesquels j'ai regardé attentivement. D'abord, le Niger. Bon, c'est le contexte que je connais le mieux, c'est mon pays, j'y suis né, j'y ai enseigné, etc. Et je suis tout à fait en ligne avec les conclusions que vous faites. Je pense que ces conclusions-là sont un peu ce que j'aurais dit. Hein. Donc là-dessus, il n'y a pas beaucoup de problèmes. Mais j'ai relevé quand même un fait important, que le rapport national volontaire ne souligne pas. Il choisit volontairement l'indice de Mo Ibrahim pour un peu masquer cela, c'est que les progrès en matière de sécurité et d'état de droit ont été plus faibles que les progrès en matière de développement humain et d'opportunités économiques. Et ça, c'est rare. Même si c'est le pays qui a le plus faible développement humain, il y a quand même eu des progrès. Et en matière de sécurité et d'état de droit, on a décru. Et quand vous allez regarder en détail dans le BTI, vous relevez un certain nombre de points qui me paraissent cruciaux pour l'ODD 16. C'est par exemple la corruption, mais la corruption dans le système judiciaire. La corruption dans le procurement, par exemple, c'est assez courant. Mais quand la corruption est dans le système judiciaire, l'indicateur d'accès à la justice ou les indicateurs de construction de tribunaux ou de nombre de magistrats n'ont plus beaucoup de pertinence. De la même façon, le recrutement du personnel de l'État, le recrutement du personnel administratif semble se faire davantage sur des systèmes de patronage et de clientélisme qu'au mérite. Et ensuite, il y a les habituels problèmes de confiance réduite entre les gens qui limitent largement l'action collective, sans compter, j'ai relevé le point aussi de l'insuffisance ou de la diminution de la transparence budgétaire. Donc, il y a une asymétrie d'information entre les acteurs éventuellement qui travaillent pour le changement et puis ceux qui sont au pouvoir. Ça aussi, ça affecte l'efficacité de l'action collective. Mon prochain slide, s'il vous plaît. Alors, la Sierra Leone, ça aussi, j'ai regardé, c'est à peu près la même chose. La conclusion, c'est qu'il y a moins de fragilité, plus de paix. Et c'est vrai. Vu d'où vient la Sierra Leone, l'état actuel des choses, c'est effectivement davantage de paix, moins de fragilité. Je suis beaucoup moins optimiste que les auteurs sur le pronostic, sur ce qui va se passer dans l'avenir. Parce que ce que le plan de développement à moyen terme semble être une promesse d'une réalisation plus forte, d'une mise en œuvre plus conséquente de l'ODD 16. Mais là encore, quand on regarde un peu, on fait une triangulation un peu avec les données. J'ai juste pris le BTI, mais j'aurais pu prendre d'autres acteurs qui évaluent la fragilité des États. Là aussi, on trouve une situation de corruption endémique. Même l'accès à la justice pour le BTI, je cote, c'est non existant, alors que le gouvernement se vantait un peu que la création d'une commission d'assistance judiciaire aurait permis ou devrait permettre à beaucoup de personnes très démunies d'accéder à la justice. Donc, je pense que, et là je vais vers ma conclusion, si vous pouvez mettre le dernier slide. Donc, moi, je pense que la méthodologie la triangulation comme méthodologie et les findings et les résultats sont très robustes. Il n'y a pas de doute là-dessus. Mais je pense que si on diversifie les sources de données pour la triangulation et qu'on intègre peut-être un peu plus les données qualitatives, ça peut apporter davantage de nuances et donner un profil peut-être un peu plus équilibré de la situation sur le terrain, au moins pour ces deux pays-là. Je voudrais dire avant de terminer un mot sur la Côte d'Ivoire, un autre pays que je connais bien. On peut dire exactement la même chose. Si vous jetez un coup d'œil à ce qui est donné dans les chiffres généralement publiés, et puis si vous voyez la situation concrète, enfin la situation telle qu'elle vient de se dérouler, par exemple aux dernières élections, vous verrez bien qu'on a besoin de nuances. Je vous remercie. J'enverrai mes commentaires plus écrits à Stéphane, et puis j'espère que j'ai apporté quelque chose. S'il y a des questions, je suis prêt à répondre. Je vous remercie.
Merci énormément, professeur. Vraiment, c'est d'avoir pris le temps de faire une analyse si minutieuse de notre méthodologie et de son application à trois cas importants. Et merci pour votre encouragement à l'égard d'une vision, disons, plus nuancée des cas et de l'ensemble. On y reviendra. Je vais arrêter de partager l'écran. Peut-être que notre Michel peut nous aider. Merci. Nous avons plusieurs... on va passer la parole directement aux autres participants, participantes, puisque vous avez été si patientes avec nous. Je sais que Heather McKinnon était première en ligne. Il y a aussi Jean Daudelin, Vern. Donc, je vais attendre. Je ne sais pas si Heather est encore là. Heather, est-ce que vous m'entendez? Je vais vous passer la parole en premier lieu. Et puis, on va prendre quelques questions, quelques observations des autres participants. Et puis, après ça, on relancera la balle aux panélistes, y compris les commentateurs et les commentatrices. So, let's take a few questions. Michael, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Are we using the Q&A to ask the questions?
We can do both. I think it would be better for people to express themselves verbally because everyone may not have good access to the
sounds
chat.
Good. So I'll hop on and you let me know which one to give permission first. I believe it was Heather.
Thank you. So Heather McKinnon, please.
Heather, if you could re-raise your hand, I apologize, I lowered it for you. Okay. Okay, so we're not hearing from Heather. Should we skip to
sure. Jean Daudelin, Jean Daudelin.
All right. Here you go. So Jean Daudelin has, there you go.
Okay. First of all, thank you to the presenters. This was very interesting, and et puis je vais lire avec intérêt le rapport au complet, ce que je n'ai pas encore eu l'occasion de faire. Mon commentaire, et puis qui est aussi une question, concerne le dernier point que Steve sur lequel Steve a insisté à la fin sur les implications, sur la recherche peut-être d'un cadre théorique plus complet qui permettrait d'éclairer, disons, l'analyse. Et puis, ce qui m'étonne un peu, c'est l'emphase qui est donnée à la question de la volonté politique, qui est posée comme une espèce de variable indépendante. Et puis, la question que je me pose, c'est dans quelle mesure vous avez considéré, apparemment, à tout le moins dans la discussion de la Colombie, très clairement, on parle des intérêts des élites politiques. C'est quelque chose aussi qui a été sur laquelle M. Liman Tinguiri a insisté dans son commentaire. Alors, mon commentaire question, c'est que la question, évidemment, les approches féministes intersectionnelles, postcoloniales, le mimétisme, isomorphique, et ainsi de suite, c'est intéressant, mais je me demande si dans un premier temps, il n'y aurait pas lieu de faire plus simplement une économie politique de la mise en œuvre des ODD, en particulier de l'ODD 16, c'est-à-dire se demander dans quelle mesure la mise en œuvre de ces objectifs affecte les intérêts des élites en place, ce qui permettrait d'expliquer pourquoi, dans certains cas, il y a de la volonté politique et dans d'autres cas, il n'y en a pas.
Merci beaucoup, Jean, pour cette question et provocation sympathique. On la garde en réserve et puis on va recueillir peut-être deux autres questions, s'il vous plaît. I saw Vern Redekop also had his hand up in the first round.
Okay, so I will give Vern a go. So Vern, whenever you want to unmute your mic.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank all of you for the kind of research you're doing. I think what comes through as sort of a meta reflection back to you is that there is a deep caring about what's happening in fragile and conflict affected states, and a deep, deep desire to bring out the fullness of SDG16 in a way that will really add to the quality of life of the people. So I want to put that out there as an affirmation. Then I want to comment from the point of view of integrative peace building and sort of show how we could draw out some of your observations in a heuristic kind of way. So first off, with regard to the idea of political will is not something that's easily observed objectively. We can see the results of it, but what lies behind the political will? And here I would say that if we could use integral theory, which pays attention to both the external, the observable kinds of things, as well as the interior dynamics at the individual and collective level, will is something that is an interior dynamic. It has to do with values and desires and knowledge and experience and priorities and so on, and it's linked to a particular political culture, and culture itself is an interior thing. It has many tacit dimensions to it, values that are tacitly and powerfully embedded in the way in which individual and collective groups function. So using an integral approach could help to provide a more nuanced and powerful way of coming to terms with this phenomenon. Then when we look at the isomorphic mimicry, as you call it, mimicry is mimesis, and there's a whole body, there's an international community devoted to mimetic theory based primarily on the work of René Girard, who developed the concept of mimetic desire. That is, we imitate the desires of others, and the power of mimesis to shape the values and the passions around which we do things could itself help to unlock such things as the kinds of rivalries that take place be within and between elites. And we know that in a lot of these countries, it's one elite group versus another, and the distinctions are identity based. So looking at those dynamics from a mimetic lens and using the power of mimetic theory as it's been developed could really enhance that. Then I think holding accountable those factors that could be called colonial or neo-colonial. The colonial system did not put a lot of value on SDG16. And so there's a broad legacy of hundreds of years of colonial powers not factoring that. So in terms of mimetic models, the colonial powers did not serve as positive mimetic models for leadership and governance. And so there's a need for new mimetic models, new exemplars. And so there's a need to find those leaders that have the political will and foster that within their own particular elites and parties. And I think there are examples within Africa of some leaders that have really risen above the colonial mold that was left in the wake of the colonial breakdown, but some who have come out of that with some powerful ways of moving ahead, and these need to be heralded and validated and used as examples in other places. Then I'd also refer to the complexity side of things and the need to really look for those things that emerge in the adjacent possibles that come with every movement, and perhaps even now at the time of the pandemic, while there are a lot of limiting things that come out of the COVID era, but there are new adjacent possibles that do open up, including global sharing, including creative ways of using the internet and so on. So those are just a few comments, but there are far more things that could be explored from the point of view of integrative peace building.
Thank you so much for those reflections, Vern. You've essentially given us a very enticing preview of how one could use an integrative peace building and complexity theory lens to revisit this issue of implementation of SDG 16 plus in fragile states. I think that Jean gave us a bit of a snapshot, shorter, but a snapshot of how a political economy analysis could also shed light on these issues. So let's hang on to that. I'm going to bounce this back to my co-panelists in a second, but I just want to give Heather McKinnon another chance to get in on round one, since we missed her right at the beginning. Heather, are you still there? And if so, would you like to raise an issue or will you pass?
So Heather, raise your hand.
Right.
And if you do not raise your hand, we'll go to the next speaker. Next question.
Okay, so she might have had some family care issues or something. We know what they're like, those things are like as we work in our homes. Alors, je vais passer le micro d'abord à mon collègue Teddy Sami et ensuite à Bianca et au commentateur et à Dr. Banerjee, if you'd like to pick up on any of these points that were made by Jean Daudelan and Vern Redekop in particular.
Yeah, I mean, thanks to Vern Redekop for all these comments. I don't know that literature as well as he does, certainly. I mean, I will definitely check René Girard's, the reference to René Girard's work. I mean, I look at isomorphic mimicry largely from the work of Pritchett et al. And I think, you know, there's room there. But I think this ties into what Jean was saying, which is, yeah, it would have been a lot easier to just do a simple political economy analysis. But I think what we would have missed in it would be the institutional part, right? So what I was really interested in when I looked at this, and Stephen and we talked about this, was, you know, how is it that in some cases, even though you see efforts being made, and so you could say, well, yeah, there's a will to do it there. There's a political will in terms of setting up these institutions, creating these frameworks and so on, and investing in some cases massively in them, and yet you don't see the results. So this is why I think we were drawn to this idea of isomorphic mimicry, which I think gives us a bit more, it's a richer, I think, analysis in terms of tying it to, you know, to what we were trying to do, which is essentially looking at not just how elites and different actors interact with each other, but also how do they interact in the presence of institutions that they are setting up, and yet in some cases don't seem to be showing much in terms of results, right? So it's this balance between a desire to do something and the outcome that you see on the ground that we were interested in. And I want to tie this back to one question that was put in the chat box, which is, are we seeing a correlation between, and this was asked by Saswan Rifai, if I pronounce Sausan Rifai, which is the correlation or causality between, you know, the extent to which you pay attention to it and the results. And I would say that based on our simple matrix that we have, it's not clear that there's actually a clear correlation between the two, right? In some cases, you can see, you know, high attention, high outcomes in the case of Timor-Leste, but you have other cases where you have high attention but low outcomes. Again, I will put a caveat there that this is largely based on about 8 cases, and I think looking at more cases would probably give us a more sort of data points to look at. So I wouldn't say that we've observed a clear pattern, but that there is certainly no clear correlation that emerges to us that just because you seem to be paying attention to something, that the outcome that it would actually translate into a positive outcome. So this is why I think this idea of isomorphic mimicry can be quite helpful, because you may be showing attention, at least in principle, but in actual fact, the results don't pan out, right? So again, we go back to this idea of trying to mimic what's happening or pretending that you're doing something, but then not actually delivering on the outcome side. Thank you.
Thank you, Teddy. Bianca, would you like to come in on any of these points? No pressure.
Yeah, I'll also weigh in quickly. Thank you everyone for all of these fantastic points and feedback. It's really great to hear. I'll comment briefly on the political will point that Vern made, which thank you so much for that. It's true that it's not an objective factor. It's something that we can merely observe, and it's based on a variety of different things that are happening often behind the scenes in these states. Like there's no objective way to determine whether the will is there, and that was part of our challenge going into this research. And so what we have observed just based off of our selection of case studies is that it was clearer to see the will to implement change in examples like Sierra Leone and Timor-Leste, where the resources weren't necessarily there, but the will was so clear in their voluntary national reviews, and it made them stand out from our other samples. And we were comparing that earlier this week with Colombia, for example, which is a country that has more resources and has more technical capacity, but is still not enacting the change that we've seen in Timor-Leste, for example. And so that political will is a little more ambiguous. And so I agree with you completely, and thank you so much for raising that point, that it's difficult for us to make an objective observation. It's a lot of speculation at the same time, and that's definitely something that we'll have to work through as we continue building our paper. So thank you for all of these comments.
Thank you. So if I may just pick up on a few points before passing it back to Chiari and Nipa, and then taking a second round of questions. I see Louise Ouimet and Radan Al-Sakaf have their hands up for the second round of questions. So anybody else who'd like to get in on the second round, please do. So 2 things briefly. So Teddy has explained to Jean's question about possible benefits of using political economy lens to analyze the nexus between interests, power, and political will. Teddy has explained very eloquently why we chose this a neo-institutional lens this time. My own view is that it's not inherently superior. And I think that a political or different political economy lenses would probably shed light on different aspects of the sort of politics of SDG16 plus compliance in different countries. And ditto with regards to any other theoretical framework, whether it's a post-colonial feminist framework or whether it's a complexity theory lens. I think they will reveal different layers, if you will, different issues, different actors, different dynamics, different dimensions, and probably lead to very different research. So that said, another institutional factor, je vais le dire en français puisque Dr. Liman-Tinguere a fait ce point en français, c'est très important. Je suis tout à fait d'accord avec vous et avec Vern quand vous dites que le mimétisme peut être positif, peut être constructif lorsqu'il s'agit de faciliter l'apprentissage hein, des élites dans n'importe quel pays, y compris ces pays-là, l'apprentissage de façon de faire, de façon de générer des données fiables, de façon de les analyser, de façon de les agréger, réunir dans des rapports, de façon de les présenter, etc., etc. Je suis tout à fait d'accord que dans le système onusien des droits humains, il y a des indications que ce genre de mimétisme a entraîné certains changements au niveau des comportements de certains États. Hein. Mais la grande différence pour moi, c'est que dans le cadre des institutions des droits humains, pour la défense des droits humains, il y a le gouvernement a l'obligation de présenter un rapport chaque 5 ans sur différentes conventions, ainsi que l'examen pour l'examen périodique universel. Mais les ONG ont le droit de présenter des rapports indépendants et l'ONU triangule et l'ONU émet ses conclusions à la fin. Et les États sont contraints, au moins sur papier, ils sont obligés de prendre ces recommandations en compte. Dans le système de suivi mis en place pour l'application, le suivi des ODD, ce n'est pas comme ça que ça se fait. Les gouvernements présentent des rapports volontaires ou pas. Les ONG et d'autres organisations de la société civile sont consultés ou pas dans ce processus. Ils n'ont aucune plateforme pour l'instant pour présenter leur autre rapport et il n'y a aucune instance qui triangule, qui compare et qui émet des conclusions, disons, plus complètes, etc. Donc, c'est dans l'absence de ce mécanisme que nous avons trouvé que cet exercice était important, cet exercice de triangulation. Mais ceci étant dit, votre point sur la nécessité de consulter d'autres sources internationales comme le Berlin Index, mais aussi nationales, d'organisations de droits humains, par exemple, au niveau national, pour compléter le cadre sur chaque cas, est tout à fait chaleureusement accueilli, chaleureusement reçu. On that note, Dr. Limantinguiri or Nipa, would you like to pick up on any of the points or elaborate on some of the comments you made or press us on some of the issues we haven't come back to yet before we go to the second round?
Je peux?
Oui.
Alors, je vais dire deux choses. Je pense que, effectivement, une approche en termes d'économie politique peut aider votre recherche pour la raison suivante. L'une des difficultés avec la fixation des objectifs mondiaux, et ça a été relevé depuis les OMD, c'est qu'on fixe l'objectif, on fixe là où on veut aller, mais on n'a pas de données sur les conditions initiales. C'est très important. Fixer le même objectif au Tchad et à la Côte d'Ivoire, rigoureusement, ce n'est pas faisable, puisque entre le Tchad et la Côte d'Ivoire, il y a un écart terrible. Quand vous prenez un ODD comme l'ODD 16 et que vous réalisez que dans un pays comme le Tchad, où plus de la moitié de la population a moins de 20 ans, et que le président qui gouverne est là depuis 30 ans. C'est-à-dire que 60% de la population n'ont pas connu d'autres formes de gouvernement, d'autres personnes qui incarnent le gouvernement de toute leur vie. C'est ça que ça signifie. Ça ne peut pas être... C'est très délicat de dire que ces pays-là doivent rendre compte des mêmes objectifs. Ça, c'est le premier point. Le deuxième point, c'est en ce qui concerne la volonté politique. Je pense qu'il ne faut pas... Je pense que c'est surpondérer la volonté politique si on considère la seule soumission du rapport comme étant un indicateur ou un proxy pour la volonté politique. Très sincèrement. Dans la pratique, lorsque vous avez 2 ou 3 donateurs sur le terrain, si vous avez l'ambassadeur du Canada et l'ambassadeur de France qui le souhaitent, et que vous avez une agence des Nations Unies qui le souhaite et qui sont prêts à financer les ateliers, eh bien la volonté politique est là. Vous avez rarement des gouvernements qui vont s'opposer à des donateurs qui poussent pour faire ça. Alors, peut-être si on veut apprécier la volonté politique, il faut aller dans le détail, il faut voir si le processus a été financé sur le budget national ou si ça a été financé sur des donateurs. Si c'est effectivement l'État qui a financé ça sur ses ressources, qui a payé les consultants, qui a financé les ateliers, qui a financé la reproduction du rapport, etc. Peut-être on peut parler de volonté nationale, mais très souvent, c'est un package qu'on offre. Il faut être très sincère. Quand vous êtes sur le terrain, vous êtes chef d'agence, vous êtes content que votre pays présente ce rapport-là. Et donc, quand vous venez avec ça, c'est assez rare que ça soit refusé. C'était les 2 points que je voulais faire.
Merci beaucoup. Duly noted. Nipa, would you like to come in at this point? We can't hear you. Can you please unmute your microphone?
Yes. Is it okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. You know, I found that my comments were very different from most others. What I tried to do was to pick some of your findings and try to apply it to a real life situation in Thailand. I would have been interested to have a bit of a discussion and maybe in our FSRN planning, we can include sometime issues of this nature, how I would say academic findings, how they can influence the real life situations. And maybe from those, the national governments and our government can take leads. I was thinking of, rather than talking here, perhaps I could do a blog sometime and detail out how these could work. This isomorphic mimicry business, I mean, that is so much present in different countries, I'm sure, and definitely in Afghanistan. You know, that could be followed up on. Another thing I'm interested in is you've said that you've done comparisons. This was not very much reflected in the working paper or in the presentations today very clearly. Was it the comparisons?
We tried.
Well, I find comparisons are very difficult. I mean, if there are comparisons, it should be between countries in the same fragility index, same ranking, because otherwise, you know, with vast differences in socioeconomic situations and other contexts, it is difficult to, whether or not the contrasting is fair enough, is something that needs to be looked at. I think these are all probably practitioners' questions and not theoretical as much. And you could connect these with your theoretical study as well. So that's it. I mean, I don't have too much to say. Now, say, for instance, another thing is that there has been no mention of donor responsibilities and what's happening. I mean, we talk about political will, put a lot of the blames on political will, but more than political will, also are the donor interventions and the way they do it. And it's very serious. You know, the isomorphic mimicry should not continue to exist when the donors are still involved, particularly in the highly fragile situations.
So thank you very much for those points. On the third point about donors, so Dr. Liman Tingwiri also made the same point and elaborated on the role of donors, the importance of factoring donors and other international institutions into our analysis. So point taken. Also, I'll come back to the issue of practical utility at the country level right at the end if we haven't had a chance to come back to that. So thank you so much. Je vais passer la parole d'abord à Madame Ouimet et ensuite au Dr. Al-Sakaf. Okay. So Louise, Can you unmute your microphone, please, and jump in? Allez-y.
Yeah, bonjour.
Bonjour.
Bon, vous m'entendez bien?
Oui.
Bon, merci. Ben, je vous remercie beaucoup d'organiser ce webinaire pour présenter les résultats, du moins préliminaires de vos recherches. C'est très utile. Moi, évidemment, je suis une praticienne. Certains de mes points ont déjà été soulevés et entre autres, celui que je voulais faire aussi, qui est en rapport avec les facteurs externes, c'est-à-dire est-ce que vous avez analysé l'importance et l'impact des pressions de la communauté internationale et qui, pour moi, ont un effet important sur le mimétisme isomorphique. Puis je vais donner là-dessus deux exemples pour ne pas être très long, mais un du côté des pays de l'Afrique francophone. On sait très bien que le discours de la Baule lors d'un sommet de la francophonie en 1990, je crois, a un peu sonné l'alarme pour les pays africains en disant « Oh là, maintenant, il faut se démocratiser ». Et plutôt que d'avoir une réflexion approfondie, comment est-ce que mon pays pourrait se démocratiser, à quel rythme, de quelle façon, quel type d'institution ou de loi électorale on veut, ils ont simplement ouvert la porte, on va faire des élections et ouvert au multipartisme, ce qui a donné naissance dans bien des cas, dans bien des pays, à des centaines de partis politiques et des élections qui sont plus ou moins crédibles. Je vais m'arrêter ici pour cet exemple-là. L'autre exemple qui est très, très récent, c'est suite au coup d'État qui a eu lieu le 18 août dernier au Mali. Il y a eu immédiatement encore une pression internationale, y inclus africaine, pour le rétablissement de l'ordre constitutionnel, comme on dit, pour que des élections puissent être organisées très rapidement. Alors, pour moi, ceci est vraiment contraire, en fait, à amener une réflexion profonde qui pourrait amener les gens du pays à réfléchir en profondeur en termes de comment peut-on rétablir la sécurité dans notre pays, comment on peut mettre en place une décentralisation qui fonctionne. Et ensuite, quel type d'institution pour organiser les élections, quel type de système politique on a besoin. Et tout ça ne se fait pas en 12 et 18 mois, évidemment. Donc, moi, je pense que la pression internationale a vraiment un rôle à jouer et pas toujours positif. Voilà. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Louise, pour le point général. Je pense que vous êtes maintenant plusieurs à avoir insisté sur l'importance d'inclure les acteurs internationaux dans notre analyse des facteurs qui semblent influencer le mimétisme, mais aussi les variations dans certains cas peut-être. Et excellent exemple, le cas du Mali récemment et auparavant aussi est tout à fait important et paradoxal dans ce contexte-là. Donc, c'est noté. Dr. Al-Sakaf, can you hear us? Would you like to come on? Please unmute your mic.
Yes, perfect. Yes, hello, Stephen, and hello, everyone, and thank you for this very interesting and stimulating discussion. I would want to say that for us in the UN, the countries that are least likely to make meaningful progress towards Agenda 2030 are indeed the conflict-affected and fragile countries, which requires us to redouble our effort and see what is not working and what can we do. And the SDGs are not created equal. For example, one key issue we do is that we follow the money and we look at the donor funding per SDG. We see that SDG16 receives almost double the average funding for the other SDGs, and there is a lot of donor interest towards addressing issues in relation to the strengthening the resilience of countries, investing in elections, institutions, rule of law, and these are very expensive investments. However, we don't see the returns that we would like to see on that. And on that note, particularly, we've been trying to work out why exactly are those dynamic in such way, trying to develop and strengthen our understanding of these issues. And one thing which I'd like to touch on is the issue of the political will, which particularly Dr. Tanjuri hit the nail on the head. There are multiple issues, and this needs significant more unpacking in my view. policymakers have the dilemma between balancing the interests of the elites and also the progress that needs to happen. But we see that happening much better and much easier to deal with at the local level, and trying to decentralize different governance structures and see at the subnational level how the dynamics interplay versus at the national level. The national voluntary reviews are written at the national level, and they don't include the same level of consultations and engagements from other levels of governance. And we see, for example, that where countries where you have a highly centralized governance structure, there is a more likelihood that you will have the policymakers' dilemma not contributing to the way we would like to see it extending. On the concept of isomorphic mimicry, I'd be keen to learn about how that plays up between national level institutions and subnational level institutions and so on. I'll give you the example of Iraq, which is one of the case studies where you have the region of Kurdistan able to manage its affairs in a much better way, despite not having the same legacy of governance institutions versus at the national level. So we see that there is more likelihood to achieve more meaningful progress towards SDG16 at the subnational level, at the level of Kurdistan, versus at the national level. So I just wanted to share this practical point of view in terms of how do we work with the policymakers in resolving this dilemma and merging between these issues, and how that might be easier at the local level. And if you see a difference, for example, among states which have like a more federal system, which has more decentralization, also fiscal decentralization, and enabling more successful isomorphic mimicry and trying to follow on the best examples. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions and that challenge, if you will, to actually move our level of analysis down one level to the subnational level. Probably can't do it in this particular study, but I think it's an invitation to all, including yourself, Dr. Asakaf, to actually explore subnational dynamics. I suspect that can only be done well in very few cases at once, one or a few at most, in order to really do justice to subnational dynamics and subnational variations. But perhaps one of my colleagues would like to come back to that. I don't see any other hands up. We have maybe time for just one more question or observation before we hand it back to the panelists. Est-ce qu'il y aurait d'autres questions ou observations? Madame Rifai, si vous êtes encore en ligne, j'ai vu de l'action. J'ai vu votre rapport dans le chat. Est-ce que vous voulez brièvement intervenir verbalement ou vous préférez laisser ça dans le chat, comme vous voulez? Est-ce qu'il y aurait d'autres intervenants, intervenantes? Okay, so let's take that as the last round of question closed. So I'll hand it back to you first, Teddy, for closing thoughts on some of those issues.
So I will, thanks, Raidan. It's nice to hear you. We haven't seen you for a while. Very good point about subnational aspect. It's something we haven't really looked into, but I think it's worth thinking more about it. You know, whether there's a difference with different types of governments in different countries. I think it's something we can look into. Louise and Nipa, I think your point about isomorphic mimicry is exactly the point that Len Pritchett and his co-authors have made. And this is perhaps something that we should make clearer in the paper. Namely that, isomorphic mimicry, the problem with it is often that donors are imposing, for lack of a better word, imposing institutions on countries that may simply not work. And Pritchett's work actually talks about this extensively, where he and his co-authors argue that one of the things that donors should recognize is that they make mistakes when they impose these types of institutions on countries that simply do not have a capability to then implement what they're recommending. So this is exactly what this concept is referring to. And I think it's up to us to fix that. Like we can certainly elaborate. One of the challenges that Stephen, myself, and Bianca faced was that the paper just got too long and we were trying to cut a lot of it. because, you know, we think if you want to publish it somewhere, it has to be, you know, kept at a reasonable level. But I think it's a point that has come back time and time again. So we will certainly elaborate on this. But, you know, your point is well taken. I mean, this is precisely what this is about. And one of the things that come out of this analysis is that we should also make an effort to try to measure better. Because you can't just measure the appearance of what's going on. You need to measure real outcomes. And I think the classic example here is in education, right? You cannot really measure enrollment. You have to measure the learning that takes place in schools. And so this is the challenge is, you know, how do you get to reliable indicators where you can actually bypass mimicry, right? So you're measuring in such a way that you're not actually measuring things that appear to be happening, but the real outcome of a particular policy. So I will leave it at that, but thank you for the comments.
Thank you very much, Teddy. Bianca, would you like to come back on any of these issues?
Yeah, of course. So I'll just weigh in quickly on the most recent comments that were made by Raiden about the subnational level, because it's absolutely right that in a lot of the cases that we looked at, it's so much easier for local governments to enact the changes that we want to see because they have much more control and it's more centralized at that level. But again, we run into the issue of data collection and being able to validate this progress. We had like such a hard time keeping or making sure that data was as updated as possible when we first took a look at the national level, what was being reported at the national level by official UN data. We had some SDG16 indicators that hadn't been updated since 2006, 2008, and that's because of a variety of factors. And so it was difficult for us to even just look at the national level, and there were so just questions raised about whether that data could be corroborated. And that's why we decided to, in the paper, rely on third-party resources in order to validate or fill in some of those gaps that we ran into. So I agree that at the subnational level, there's opportunities to be a lot more effective, and Kurdistan is a great example of that. But data collection was just such a hurdle for us in putting this together. It would certainly be difficult, but so that's all I wanted to say.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Bianca, for coming back to those methodological constraints or challenges that we also faced. Let me take this opportunity. We have to close in literally in 5 minutes. But I'd like to come back to Nipa's very important point about the practical utility or practical limits of this kind of study. First, Nipa, this is an entirely fair question. And this paper is not just academic, it seeks also to be of some social utility. And so as I hinted at the end in my conclusion, but you saw some of that in the paper a little bit more, and we should sharpen that definitely in our revisions of the paper. One of the things that this study points to is that there's scope let me put it this way. The scope for shadow reports in SDG monitoring and evaluation processes should be expanded. There's nothing stopping CSOs or transnational coalitions of CSOs from submitting shadow reports on particular SDGs or particular countries, right? It's being done. In fact, the CCIC and Carleton University have been collaborating with partners and CSOs in other parts of the world to submit a shadow report on civil society inclusion and SDG implementation and assessment processes, right? So it can be done even though there's no formal mechanism, unlike the UN human rights machinery, where there are formal mechanisms for NGO reporting and then for the UN, for the committee and its staff to triangulate those reports and issue its own conclusions and recommendations. So I think we should flesh that out, that practical implication out in this paper. the same thing could be said at the national level. And linking this back to donors, I think that we should be perhaps more explicit about recommending that donors, in addition to continuing to support governmental consultations and report making on that consultative basis, we should also encourage donors to support national, particularly national civil society organizations and their attempts to hold their own government accountable for pieces of SDG16 and the rest of the SDG project. I think that's extremely important. Now, beyond that, this is not the paper that will enable us to drill down and recommend particular policy changes or practical changes to particular governments or CSOs in Niger or in Afghanistan, et cetera. For that, I think my position is we need, country case studies. Having worked on Haiti for over 15 years and on SSR in that context and struggled to do so well, I can assure you that I encourage, would certainly encourage, I think my co-authors would do the same, encourage people who do case studies, deep case studies, and who, like you, have worked for years, decades in a particular context, to continue providing the kind of nuanced analysis that is required in order to provide useful policy recommendations at the national, not to mention at the subnational level. Okay, so hopefully that provides some satisfaction. So to check that, I'm going to hand the last word back to you, Nipa, and then quick to Kiari, and then I'll just close and thank everybody right at the end. So Nipa, go ahead. Any last comments or observations, suggestions?
I really don't have any last comments, except I would like to seek answers to some of the issues that I brought up on donor responsibilities, and political will is a very difficult thing. And the way I think, was it Jean Daudelin who commented, it's very difficult to go into the culture, particularly not being in the country, to go into different country cultures and measure something. So except you have to depend on the analysis done in location. Regarding localization or at subnational, a localization of SDG goals at the subnational level, there is a book that was, Stephen, you are aware, was published. It was edited by FCAS, and I was involved in the editing as well. But there are cases that are presented there for localization. And I really think Afghanistan hasn't done poorly in localization because of its very early introduction of the National Solidarity Program, where they were trying to get the local institutions involved, and also yes, those local institutions. The follow-up of the National Solidarity Program is Citizen Charter Program, and that one also localizes very well. Actually, I'm very critical of a lot of the programming, but I'm supportive of this programming. Unfortunately, I mean, there's not that much of support yet given by Canadian government. I mean, I haven't looked at others on the Citizen Charter, and the National Solidarity Program. In fact, a large part of it was withdrawn when we went to Kandahar. So, but this thing should be looked at. It was not looked at so much from the point of view, in those days, from the point of view of localization of subnational goals. They were treated as independent programs, but now it can be connected with the localization process. And probably localization will be much more easy rather than looking at the entire country, particularly in Afghanistan, which is quite different. But because of the tribal tensions and ethnic tensions between the ethnic groups, etc. So, I mean, that's what my comments are. But it would be very interesting, Stephen, if you did a blog first on what we found today, and then later on continue with it.
Thanks very much, Nipa, for closing your comments on that suggestion, which has fallen on sympathetic ears. So we'll come back to that and we'll continue the discussion also offline. So, Dr. Liman-Tinguili, est-ce que vous aimeriez ajouter quelques commentaires à la fin?
Merci Stéphane. Deux choses très rapides. Bon, je vais vous envoyer par écrit un peu mes notes plus élaborées que les slides. Et puis, peut-être un peu nuancer le donor-driven. Ce n'est pas toujours bon, mais ce n'est pas toujours mauvais. C'est important. Par exemple, dans beaucoup de pays, la vaccination, c'est donor-driven, mais ça sauve la vie des enfants. Voilà. Donc, il faut être nuancé avec ces choses-là. Voilà, c'est tout ce que j'ai à dire.
Merci beaucoup. Insistant sur l'importance de nuancer au niveau national et international. Merci beaucoup. Alors, sans plus, j'aimerais d'abord remercier le CIPS pour tout l'appui qu'il nous a donné, non seulement pour l'organisation de cet événement, mais aussi pour lancer ce projet, voilà 1 an et demi. Donc, merci Anna, merci Rita, merci les collègues du CEPI. Thank you warmly to my co-authors and colleagues from Carleton University. I think the fact that we have been able to do this paper, the study together, write the paper together, organize this event together, and so on is very promising for future inter-university collaboration in this area and in others. And so thank you to you and to other colleagues and students from Carleton who joined us today. Et merci à vous tous et toutes de tous les horizons. Je vois même des noms des collègues qui se sont branchés depuis l'Afrique, depuis le Cameroun, depuis la Côte d'Ivoire, donc des partenaires dans le cadre de la chaire UNESCO, défis du développement, etc. Merci à vous aussi d'avoir pris le temps de participer à cette discussion aujourd'hui. Ce n'est qu'un moment dans une discussion qui continuera. Donc, au plaisir d'approfondir avec vous par l'entremise de blogs, d'autres échanges. Éventuellement, nous espérons publier cet article. Jean, we heard you and others who requested the working paper. We're still mulling that over because we don't want to jettison our chances of actually publishing this in a scientific journal, but let's see what we can do to share it between good colleagues in the meantime. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, CIPS. Thank you, co-authors. Thank you to the commentators, Nipa and Chiari, for your excellent comments today and for taking so much time to engage with us so seriously. So thank you, and to be continued. Next FSRN event will be, I think, on Afghanistan with Saeed Parto in January, inshallah. So stay tuned for that. Teddy, Bianca, any last comments before we close? No? Okay. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for your tech support, indispensable tech support and good humor along the way.